Is the European Union on the brink of collapse? Emmanuel Macron just dropped a bombshell, warning that the EU could be heading for disaster if it doesn't act fast. Speaking at the Berlin Global Dialogue, the French president didn't hold back, saying Europe's overregulation and lack of investment are putting it far behind global giants like China and the US. With the EU's 27 member states struggling to keep up in terms of economic growth, is this a wake-up call for major reforms? Stay tuned as we break down what Macron's dire warning could mean for the future of Europe. Macron went on to say, "The EU could collapse. We are at the edge of a very critical moment." He argued that the traditional economic model is no longer effective, citing that the bloc is too focused on regulation and lacks sufficient investment. He warned that if the EU continues with its current economic policies over the next 2 to 3 years, it risks being pushed out of the global market. The urgency in his words is pretty striking. It feels like Macron is trying to send a wake-up call. If the EU keeps following the same economic strategy, it could face even tougher competition internationally. I wonder if he thinks this is a short-term crisis or something more long-term. 2 or 3 years is not a long time at all, especially for governments and institutions that tend to move slowly. This kind of warning could lead to some intense debates within the EU. Macron is urging EU member states to continue advancing the banking union project, a framework aimed at ensuring financial stability and safety across the Eurozone and the broader EU. The initiative is seen as a critical step toward creating a more reliable financial sector within Europe. It's interesting that he's pointing to the banking union as a solution. Financial stability is obviously a big piece of the puzzle when it comes to economic competitiveness. But implementing something like this across the whole EU is a massive undertaking. It makes me wonder how much support he'll get from the other member states, especially when financial policies can be so divisive. This warning comes after former Italian Prime Minister and ex-European Central Bank President Mario Draghi released a report issuing another grave economic alert. Draghi argued that the EU cannot compete on its own against global powers like China and the US unless it creates a more integrated single market that supports the development of large-scale pan-European businesses. So, Macron isn't alone in this thinking. Mario Draghi seems to be sounding the same alarms. When someone with Draghi's background is also saying the EU needs to change, that adds a lot of weight to the argument. The idea of a more integrated single market makes sense, but I'm sure some countries would be wary of giving up too much control. Balancing national interests with a unified European approach is always a tricky issue in the EU. In his report, Draghi also proposed a wider industrial strategy for Europe, suggesting that 800 billion euros would be necessary to prevent the EU from falling further behind the US and China in key industries. Wow, 800 billion. That's a staggering number, but it shows the scale of the challenge the EU is facing. Industrial strategy has been a big topic lately, especially as nations push to become more self-reliant and less dependent on global supply chains. On the defense front, Macron is also urging the EU to become more independent of the United States. Back in April, the French leader called for more military integration within Europe, warning that the EU should not become reliant on the US for security matters. This is an interesting shift. Macron is clearly pushing for more autonomy for Europe, not just economically, but militarily too. It's understandable that he doesn't want Europe to be too dependent on the US. But breaking away from that kind of reliance isn't easy. Defense is a tricky area. While many might agree that Europe should do more to stand on its own 2 feet, it's tough to imagine a future where the EU isn't looking to the US for at least some support. Similarly, Draghi's report called for increased defense spending on joint EU defense projects, suggesting that EU governments need to collaborate more in this area to maintain security in an increasingly unstable world. It seems like defense spending is becoming a bigger issue across the board. The idea of joint defense projects is appealing because it could save money while building a stronger collective defense. But how quickly can this be done? And will member states really cooperate on such a large scale? This comes in response to recent remarks by the U.S. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump, who who claimed that he would allow Russia to do whatever they want to NATO members that fail to meet their defense spending targets. Trump's statement is bound to cause a stir, especially in Europe. For countries relying on NATO and US protection, comments like this could really shake confidence in their security arrangements. Macron's focus on strengthening the EU's defense capabilities seems even more relevant in light of this. It feels like Europe is being pushed to become more self-sufficient, not just economically, but militarily as well.